With the upcoming release of Breath of the Wild sequel, the Legend of Zelda series is soon to be 20 games strong, not counting spin-off games, remakes, and these specimens. In order to keep a series with this many games still going strong to this day, Nintendo had to innovate, experiment, and change up the gameplay for each iteration. As a result, each game has their own unique traits and mechanics, which rarely transition from one game to the next. Some of these mechanics are sorely missed, and while the desire for change from the side of Nintendo is completely understandable, it would be nice if we could see some of these traits return in future games. So for this video, let's pretend for a moment that we live in a perfect world in which Breath of the Wild 2 will take inspiration from every previous installment, all the while still presenting us with new stuff we didn't know we wanted, as Nintendo has done so many times in the past. In that case, which aspect from each game could the Zelda team use to make Breath of the Wild sequel the perfect game? Today I'm joined by Xenogamer, and together we explore this question game by game and in order of release date, and we each give our own take on a specific one. This video will cover the first half of the total list, so after you're done watching this one, be sure to head over to Xeno's channel and check out part 2. This one might seem a bit unnecessary since Breath of the Wild was already largely based on the philosophy of the first game. Despite these inspirations, however, there are still things about the original which the sequel could take notes from, in particular the way it handled its exploration and sense of discovery. Despite adapting the non-linear style of its NES Elder, the discoveries you made in Breath of the Wild were not in the same vein as the original. The dungeons, or should I say the divine beasts, were able to be tackled out of order, but they didn't need to be discovered, since, well, they can literally be seen stomping around or flying around from afar. And secondly, Impa tells you exactly where to find them. In its NES counterpart, things were not always as straightforward, which made the discovery of a dungeon, better sword, secret shop, or any other mysteries all the more satisfying. Now, I am by no means saying that we need to go back to bombing every wall and burning every bush, but the discoveries you made in Breath of the Wild definitely lacked a certain variety. No matter what kind of secret area or riddle you stumbled across, you knew that in the end the result was going to be either a shrine or a Korok seed, which in and of itself kinda diminishes the surprise factor. Secret caves were practically non-existent in Breath of the Wild. Whenever you did find a bombable wall, don't expect anything more than just a small little alcove with a treasure chest or a Korok seed. Imagine climbing a hard-to-reach mountain range and finding a small little crevice and literally stumble upon a full-fledged secret dungeon or mini-dungeon with its own unique style and atmosphere. That's the kind of stuff the original definitely had going for it.
Zelda 2 is a very different game by Zelda standards, and that's something I really personally admire about it. There's a reason this game is called the black sheep of the franchise. The game is more of an RPG than it is an adventure game. Battles take place outside of the overworld map, and you level up and gain experience as you play. There are many unique things I could say Breath of the Wild 2 should learn from Zelda 2, but above all, I just want it to embrace one thing. Be weird. Zelda 2 wasn't afraid to be different. RPG and platforming elements, a plethora of new enemies, no Ganon, and even a freaking NPC named Error. In my eyes, Zelda is at its best when it embraces its less traditional side, goes off the rails a bit, isn't afraid to surprise players. Breath of the Wild has been endlessly compared to the original Legend of Zelda. Some might even go as far to say it's basically a modern-day remake. And I think that Zelda 2 might have the same kind of influence on Breath of the Wild 2. Don't be afraid to stray from that line in story or gameplay. Dare to be different.
A Link to the Past is the game which first introduced the concept of shifting between two different dimensions, in a sense doubling the size of the overworld, which in case of Breath of the Wild 2 couldn't be more fitting. Aonuma and his team have already confirmed that the sequel will see us revisiting the same Hyrule scene in the previous game. This has become somewhat of a cause for concern amongst fans, since in the 3.5 years since its release, this map has been turned inside out with every nook and cranny visited and discovered. So much so that some of us have resorted to looking beyond the borders of what we are allowed to see in the game. The light world, dark world mechanic seen in A Link to the Past was a great way to turn an otherwise quite simplistic overworld into something much deeper. As opposed to Twilight Princess, where the other dimension was identical, just darker and more gloomy, in A Link to the Past the differences were pretty significant. Caves which were present in one were absent in the other, bridges broken or intact, and even entire areas were completely different, such as the desert turning into a swamp in the other world. Something similar to this would make the overworld in the sequel feel brand new, without actually adding new provinces. It remains to be seen if something like this is doable, since the map is a lot bigger than the one in A Link to the Past. But maybe instead it could be restricted to only certain areas.
I played through Link's Awakening for the first time last year with the release of its Switch remake, and I loved the game, but was surprised by what stood out to me the most as I played through it. A mystery. A mystery I already knew the answer to. I played this game 27 years after its initial release, so I had been spoiled on the events of the story long before I booted up the game, and from the very beginning I knew the true nature of Koholint Island, but that still stuck with me as the most essential part to what makes this game so good. The mystery, and on top of that, the overall atmosphere. Link's Awakening tells a very simple story, but it's how that story unfolds and affects you that makes it so magical. The way it changes how you look at the world around you. It takes everything you've grown to care about and tells you if you beat the game, you're pulling the trigger on all that. And that's what Breath of the Wild 2 could learn from Link's Awakening. The way it uses atmosphere to drive the game's storytelling, as well as how it pulls off an excellent mystery, leading to a tremendous plot twist.
The first thing that would come to mind regarding Ocarina of Time would of course be that which is represented by its title, time travel. However, we have already covered shifting between two dimensions in A Link to the Past, which is very similar in a lot of ways, and having both traveling between dimensions and time travel would perhaps be a little bit too much. Besides, Ocarina of Time isn't the only game to feature time travel. Instead, I would opt for Breath of the Wild to take inspiration from Ocarina of Time's turning point. A lot of 3D Zelda games have some sort of a turning point in the story, but none are as prevalent as the one in Ocarina of Time. The contrast between the child section and the adult section was immense and was a real game changer for the story. All of a sudden you transition from a fragile kid who is cast into a dangerous destiny into a full-fledged badass hero. Not only that, but so many other things start snowballing as soon as you reach this point. Ganondorf stole the Triforce, Zelda is forced to flee, and the world has been destroyed or taken over in your absence. Breath of the Wild lacked such a turning point. Technically, it did have one, but it took place before the events of the actual game and can only be viewed through memories. The sequel has a chance to rectify this mistake and have us experience moments like these through actual gameplay. Say for instance, the first few dungeons take place before Ganondorf wakes up, and after he does, the world changes radically and we are presented with new challenges and objectives.
There are many reasons I call Majora's Mask one of my favorite Zelda games, but one of the biggest reasons is because, in many cases, it made me care about the side quests more than I cared about the main story. There is an elegance to the side quests in Majora's Mask. Unlike any other game in the series, every quest happens simultaneously over a period of 3 days, and as a result of this, and the main driving mechanic of time travel throughout the game, all of the work you've done to improve these people's lives is lost to time in the end. It's a very dark and surreal experience that I feel would be near impossible to replicate again. But even if Breath of the Wild 2 can't exactly carry over all of the concepts that made Majora's Mask so special, I still think it has plenty to learn from this game. You don't just remember Majora's side quest because of the unique circumstances of the overarching system of time in the game. You remember them because of the characterization they showed. Ask most Zelda fans, and I bet they will tell you to this day, Majora's Mask is the most alive a world has felt in the Zelda series. Almost every character is memorable with their own motivations and daily schedule. They realistically react to the world around them and the doom they are faced with. Not only that, but their side quests have a place in the world. In Breath of the Wild, side quests are often relegated to generic tasks given from faceless NPC travelers. These people are never really given characteristics. They exist to give you a quest, to reward you with a reward that's not even worth your time, and then disappear from your memory forever. And that's where Breath of the Wild 2 needs to learn from the example of Majora. Unique characters in personality, and quests designed to fit into the world that are fun to complete, and offer rewards that are actually worth your time.
Despite being great games on their own, Oracle of Ages and Seasons didn't introduce too many new things. Ages had time travel and Seasons sees you shifting between different seasons, which influences the overworld, both of which we've seen in the past in some shape or form. But things change when we look at the games not as individual entities but as a pair. By far the most unique aspect about them was the ability to link the two. This allowed you to transfer certain items from one to another, have characters traveling between two worlds, and getting the true ending to each story requires combining the two. Zelda games usually don't do alternative or true endings, but guess which one does? Breath of the Wild. And not only is it one of the few games to have a true ending, it's also the first time we've seen a direct sequel which takes place almost right after and stars the same Link and Zelda. How cool would it be if Breath of the Wild 1 and 2 would somehow be linked through save files? And it makes sense if you think about it, since if a player hasn't completed certain quests in the original, they wouldn't know about it, and thus it would be strange if it pops up in the sequel seemingly out of nowhere. As an example, if you've never collected the Master Sword in the original, you might start without it in the sequel, and you have to go get it first. Or if you've never completed the Tarrytown side quest, the settlement might not exist in Breath of the Wild 2. Not to mention all the amazing armor sets and other collectibles we obtained in Breath of the Wild, which would be nice if at least some of them would transfer over to the new game, like the Tunic of the Wild for instance.
Four Swords might not be the most beloved Zelda game, but it does exhibit something I always loved seeing in the Zelda series, which is new villains. Four Swords was the first game to introduce us to Vati, the dark power-hungry sorcerer. As great of a villain as Ganondorf can be, there is yet to be an instance where I have not enjoyed seeing a new character step into the role of antagonist. Whether it be secondary or main, not only is it nice to see a new villain we can face off against every once in a while, but as commonplace as it's become to see Ganon or Ganondorf playing the role of series villain, seeing new villains in the series is something I've come to see as quite refreshing. I'd love to see a totally new or even returning side villain in Breath of the Wild 2, to mix up the formula, just as Four Swords did in many ways.
This one is quite on the nose, but yeah, sea exploration. It's safe to say that exploring the open waters in Breath of the Wild sucked. And this is without taking the ability to dive underwater into account. The raft was slow and tedious, and it would be nice if we have something better like a sailboat to traverse the Big Blue. And aside from an easier way to get around the seas, what good would sea exploration be if there's nothing to explore? Expanding the sea borders a bit more and having more accessible islands would obviously have to come with it. In terms of side quests, Eventide Island was definitely a fan favorite, so it would make sense to add some more islands with cool stuff on them. Perhaps even with new races, enemies, wildlife, and maybe even a dungeon hiding on one of them. And that concludes part 1 of this list. If you like this video, be sure to head over to Xenogamer's channel and check out part 2, where we go over the rest of the games in the series. A big thanks to Xeno for joining me in this video. And as always, a massive thanks to my Patreon supporters who make these videos possible, one of which has just decided to become a member. A big thanks to Lucas Should Play Zelda for joining. And indeed, Lucas, you should play Zelda. What are you waiting for? Next week you will once again be treated to a collaboration, this time with none other than our favorite Scottish Zelda channel, Hyrule Gamer. I hope to see you then. This is Don, signing off, and have a good one.